Hey Salesforce Hubs, welcome back. My name is Shruti, Salesforce coach and YouTuber with 5.5 years of real-time Salesforce experience and about 7 months of prior information which I received as a YouTuber and as a Salesforce coach with reference to my channel Codeforce Chronicles. Today on day 9, we will learn how to write triggers that detect changes, use helper classes and follow best practices to respect governor limits. This is essential for interviews, real projects and enterprise-ready Salesforce development. Let's dive in. Even simple updates like changing a contact's email can have big consequences in a Salesforce org without proper design. Triggers can run infinitely. DML limits can be exceeded. As a reference to this context, I want you to understand that the prefix which we quote as a reference to this itinerary should be narrated to us as a reference. That is, if A to B is quoted as a reference and I want the data to be quoted as a reference in your itinerary, then I want the reference which is quoted as a reference in your caliber, that is, the data which is quoted as a prefix in your life should be quoted as a narration. Now, if I quote two prefix, that is the data which is quoted and narrated as an index, that is the index which we quote as a reference, that is A and then the reference either 0 or 1 should be quoted as a narration in your life. Now, if we quote this as a reference to our itinerary, we can understand the prefix. Now, if A is quoted as a reference to B, then B should be quoted as a reference to C. So that should be created as a prefix to the notification which you will receive. Now, when it comes to the prefix, that is A is part of B's life and B is part of C's life, as a prefix, that is a data, which will be quoted as a narration if we are not happy with the statements. So if the DML limits can be exceeded, it should be narrated as a prefix to you, that is as a quoted narration, where the related records, that is related records, may fail to update. Now, interviewers love asking, how do you design triggers that are scalable and error-free? And when it comes to the related records, we are clear that the answer can be quoted in a way that we can narrate our experience. We will answer that using a super easy example. Now, when we want to create a record in Salesforce, we should be able to conduct a surveillance on all the references that we quote as a narration. For example, updating contact email domain. Whenever a contact's email changes, update last email domain change as a update which you have to quote as a narration. Now, I will update the records of contacts only if I receive a notification from my client. So, when we speak about the references which are quoted to us, we should understand that the narration which we want to be part of, that is the quoted narration which should be part of your life as a prefix, should be narrated to you. when a contact record is updated, as a reference, but I'll quote last email domain change as a reference to the context. And we can quote this as an example. That is why it's intelligent. The reason is it teaches us to conduct a recursion control as a safety measure. Second, it shows bulk safe logic. Third, it uses helper class. For clean, maintainable, code. Other easy examples are reward points on account for revenue which is greater than 1 lakh, auto task creation on lead insert, update opportunity status when state is equal to closed one. Now, which of these small examples do you think is most useful in real projects? Comment below. I will reply to every comment. Now, let's focus on the aspect which we want to focus as a reference. The aspect which is quoted as a reference can be narrated to your circumference only if the narration is quoted as a reference in contact, trigger, helper, handler class, where you have to change the narration, that is the email address, to a update which is quoted as a reference to you and as a medium through which you can quote the reference to your itinerary. Now, when we use private, static, boolean, it is clear that the value should be quoted as a reference to you, that is already run, which is equals to false. Now, if you quote this as a narration, where I see that static void, which is used as a handler before insert update, as a reference to the method which we use, that is list, which is quoted as a reference to contact, and the trigger should be in place with the context that the new list is in place with maps as an example. And if we quote this as a narration, you should be able to conclude that the ID which we place as a context should be quoted to us as a prefix, and as a narration which can be handled without quoting it as a reference. Now if you quote this as a reference, that is the boolean value in if statement, and if you return the value that is already run as a reference to your prefix, then you have to conclude your for statement, that is the for loop, as your medium. That is contact C is in place with the new list which you have concluded as a statement. The for loop, and you can run the for loop after contact is quoted as a old C in the old map as a reference which is not equal to none, and we add the question mark as a reference to the old map as a prefix. The reason is we want old map to be quoted as a reference to the get statement, that is c.id, which can be fetched only if, that is the id can be fetched only if the narration is clear to the conclusive measure. That is, if you want to quote it as null, then the if statement which we provide should be quoted as a narration to old C. And if you have any doubt, you can quote that in the comments, where I want you to focus on the narration. That is, if you're quoting email address as a prefix, and if you want the not equal to statement to be quoted as a reference to oldc.email instead of the quoted narration to you, then you should be able to quote the narration as a prefix. Now we have to conclude our circumference, that is the statement which we have provided as a prefix, where last email domain change should be part of this context. That is, if we are able to conclude that last email domain change can be updated without the reference which is quoted as before trigger, or the context which is before insert or update can be quoted as a narration, then it is clear that the email address which we are quoting can be split into two verticals, that is the narration which we quote as a prefix, that is @ and the domain name which we want to quote as 1 can be quoted as a narration. Now if we try to save this program, we can understand that the vertical which is provided to us should be quoted as a reference, that is C dot. And the reason I wanted this to be quoted as a reference and not as a medium through which we can quote our narration is when we want to create a trigger that is quoted as a narration again, that is contact trigger. And if we want to place it in the prefix that we quote our narration, that is the contact record. And if we submit the vertical, then we can quote this as a before insert and before update value. The reason I'm quoting this as a reference to you is, if we quote that is a if statement, which will be quoted as trigger dot is before, that is prior to the vertical which we want to update, and as a narration to the handler class which we have quoted as a prefix, to be quoted as a narration to the method which we have inserted the values. Then we have to quote trigger.new comma trigger.old, and have to be quoted as a reference to the vertical, should be in place with our updates. Now, when we are quoting something which is part of our curriculum, we should narrate it as a vertical. Now, notice how the trigger is clean and readable. All logic is delegated to a helper class, which is a best practice. When it comes to the helper class, it is easy for freshers to understand that single static variables to control recursion can be used as a vertebral where we can conduct this prefix as a vertical only if we understand that trigger.new is in place with the map or the series which we want to quote. As an existence in this case. And it takes time to understand the vertical. I want you to focus on the reference which is quoted to us, that is the deliverables which are part of this context. Now, if the trigger uses trigger.new directly without any DML statements, then it is simple for loop and if check to be conducted as a reference. It demonstrates enterprise logic in one small example. Now let's start testing this in the executable window, where list of contact can be quoted as a reference, where contacts is equal to new, and list of contact can be quoted as a reference to the vertebral, that is if new contact, that is the first name, is equal to John, and last name is equal to Theo. Is quoted as a reference where email is equal to jane.test at the rate test jane at the rate test.com can be quoted as a reference to your vertical and the forwarded statement, that is to insert contacts, can be quoted as a reference to you. Then you can execute this as a reference where I want to conclude my statements. Where I see that the narration which is quoted to you, that is the request which we want to be part of the curriculum, to be quoted as a narration only if you are able to insert the contact. Now, when you're inserting the contact, you should be able to understand the logic. That is, John Dio should be quoted as a reference to our update. Now, I'll add a prefix to this update only if it is quoted to me as a narration. That is the email address which should be quoted as an update in our circumference. Now, contacts can be in place with the email address that is equal to John @new domain.com. And I want you to understand that when you're putting a reference of yours, that is the updates or the email address which is quoted as a value which you want to execute in your narration, then the quoted narration should be quoted as a valid statement. Now we'll focus on executing the highlighted values. Where we have to execute this statement, that is the insert contact values shouldn't be quoted as a narration until we quote the narration which is quoted to us as a prefix. Okay. If you want the statements to be quoted to us, where we can quote the test as testing.com, then we can execute this narration. Okay, so if you want to quote a narration, that is John D, which we have quoted as a reference, then when new domain name is clear as a prefix. Now if I change the domain, the reference, that is new contact, then the update that is quoted to us that is a account's name which we have to quote as a prefix. Venture private limited as a narration to the vertical then after we save the domain, where data change by trigger for the last email domain change, invalid email address has been hidden. So where we understand that the value has been hidden. That is the field last email change is invalid email address. So if the value has been hidden as a prefix, then we have to quote the narration again. That is, if we want to change the updates that the value has been hidden, then it is clear that it is not the error in a quote. There are reasons why we have to quote this as a reference. That is a field level security, which should be quoted as a reference. Now you can quote a statement which can help us to understand if the system.debug statement can help us to conclude that C dot last name or email address based on the reference can be quoted as a context. That is, if you want the debug log to narrate the consequence, and we are clear that the testing.com reference is clear with the vertical, then the domain name should be part of the contact. Now we are clear that the contact is not in place with the narration. Because of one reason, that is, the narration which is quoted to us should be quoted as a reference. Now, if you want to execute a statement that is the last email change to be quoted as a reference, where we are clear that now if you are focusing on the errors, then we have to quote the reference to the narration. Now, if we focus on this event and if we remove this context and if we try to update the value to contacts instead of contact, and if we are able to update the value, where we have to change the reference, that is That is the error which we are receiving to change the data. The value has been hidden. Here you have to work on the code which is part of your statements. Where if statement which you've provided should contain a prior check where C thought email should be quoted as not equal to null and C dot email dot contains should be quoted as a reference where at the rate should be equivalent to the prefix, that is old C as a reference to the vertical, that is equal to, and change the statements to or as a vertical which is not equal to the email address which is provided. Now when we see the changes, we should be able to add substring after as a reference to the vertical. We have to save the changes after we quote this as a narration. Now when it comes to when we are able to conclude the statements as a reference, and if we are able to save the records without quoting the changes, as a reference to our vertical where we can change the name of the person, that is Jacob B, and instead of Jane we can quote it as John. And the new contact should be quoted as a reference where we can execute the statements. Only if we find the reference it is quoted to us as a prefix. And if we are not able to change the trigger that is the last the email address. Then we have to change a quoted narration now, and we are able to understand that the value is hidden. And if the value is encrypted, then you can fix the values only if we are able to save the records. Now, if we are able to read the code, that is, if we are placing our statements, instead of private, I quote it as public, that is the access modifier, and if I'm able to so instead of quoting this as a narration, I can remove this line and quote public static as a value which can be added, and when it comes to the for statement, we can remove these statements which are not applicable to the new list, and if we place our statements where we want the narration to be quoted to us, then we can save this record by just removing the negative scenarios and quoting this as a reference. Now, when we have to save a record, it's clear that we have to place the account name in the circumference, and if I'm changing the contacts, it should be hertz to the narration which is quoted to us, that is the logs where we have to read the statements where the changes are reflecting in the catalog. But we are not able to handle the changes as a preference. The reason is the narration which is quoted to us, that is the root cause analysis which we have to conduct as a preference to our identical where we have to quote that is the narration which is quoted to us should be quoted as a reference, and and if we change the circumference, that is after insert and after update, and if we want the changes to reflect based on the circumference, then we can work on the vertical which is provided to us. But we are clear that the narration which is quoted to us, that is the static value, which is false, and after we quote the value, we should be able to conclude a list as a statement, that is to update as a reference to the new list which will be quoted to us. This reference can work only if we quote the narration to the for loop as a reference to the list which we can quote as an update. Now, when we read the narration, it is clear that the new list should be part of old C as a old map, and if it's not equal to null, the question mark, that is the reference to the old map, should be adhered to as a reference where we conclude the statements. Now, if c.email is not equal to null and you are able to quote the narration, and if we want to update a value using the to update as a preference to the list that we want to narrate as a contact, and if we want to add a new value, that is the new contact as a reference, then we have to open the brackets and understand the narration. If ID is quoted as c.id, that is the contact ID, then where we understand that the quoted narration is true only if the last email address, that is the field where we have to update the domain as a preference. And as a substring. And if we are able to narrate the circumference with the quotations, and if the narration is true, where we have to remove the identicals, and if the to update is not part of the circumference, where we have to quote is empty as a reference to the update values as a list, where we have to update the to update list. the insert statement is before insert and not after insert as a medium. Then we have to quote the narrations to the verticals and not the executable statements, where I see that the contacts or the records which we quote as a narration, contacts incorporation as a reference. So the vertical which we want to quote as a reference in our deliverable and if we are not able to understand the vertical, that is to quote the narrations to the substrings. That is the value where we have to conclude our statements. Where we have to quote after trigger update as a preference only if we want the narration to be quoted to us. The incorporation or the commonality or the common references that we quote as a prefix. Contacts which they have to venture as a preference. And if we are able to conclude the before insert as a prefix and not after insert, where we see the venture we quoted as a narration, and if we are able to conclude our statements the contacts help you to understand the debug statement. Where system.debug should be quoted as a reference to the email address that we are quoting as a reference. Now, if we are able to understand the reference where we are quoting a narration, we have to make few changes in the code. That is, the narration which I'm quoting to you as a reference, where the updates, that is if update, should be quoted as a return statement, and after we quote a narration, that is the substring, we have to quote old map as a reference. Old map is not equal to null and if contact old C is equal to old map, which is not equal to null, old map dot get is quoted as a reference to the ID, that is the contact ID. Then the quote if statement as a reference where c.email of the contact should not be equal to null. The reason is the statements which we are providing as a proof, and if c.email is the contact's email contains the vertical as a statement, and if c.email is not equal to all c.email, that is the parameter that we want to place our statements, then the vertical which we provide will be equal to the updates dot add. Now we have to quote to update dot add with the same reference this quoted as a reference, and the verticals should be provided, that is the 3 braces which we can quote as a reference, and as a prefix that we are including that to update dot is empty, can be quoted as a reference only if the update is quoted as a reference to the update. Now, when we reach the context, that's the for loop. Before old map is concluded to us as a statement, and if old C is quoted as a reference, So let's read the code again. So we have used the helper class where we are quoting the narration, which is public static void helper class, where we can quote the list, this new contact list, along with the map, which is the old map, as a reference to the for loop. Now, when we use the for loop, we are clear that if we are quoting an if statement, then it should be clear that we are using old map. That is, if we quote old map as a reference and the null statements, and if we are able to quote c dot email is not equal to null, and c dot email dot contains where the reference is quoted as a medium. Where have to quote the last email with the notation or the annotation or the notification or the quotation. So I made it as notations for you to understand the logistic which we want to quote as a reference. That is the substring which will be quoted as a prefix. Now, if you are not able to understand the logistic, that is to get the IDs, and if you are able to place the if statement is not equal to null, and after we quote the adds the read statement as a proof, that is, if c dot email is not equal to null and the contains method is used as a statement where we can refer the email address which is not equal to the new email address, again I'll quote this as a reference, where if we use the statements, we should be able to quote the reference. That is the if statement which we are using. That is after we receive the notification. Now, if we are able to understand the logistic, that is the email address which we have to quote as a narration. Where we understand that the quoted narration is just used to update the logistics. Then we can conclude the statements which are related to the updates. Now if we change the reference, that is the email address, to insured.com, and if you are not able to understand the vertical which is provided to us, then we can quote this as a narration where the email address format, that is the @ symbol or domain, contains invalid characters, so it's spaces. So when it comes to the contact trigger or the last email chain, where we can use the debug statements to understand the logistic, where if we change the data, that is if we want to understand the narration. So if we have to change the statement, there are ways to handle the situation, that is by quoting this as a reference in your itinerary, that is by commenting the lines which we want to place as a statement. For now, you can quote the entire passage, that is the forwarded narration, as a comment. So that we are clear with the context and the narration. Now there's a way to handle this situation where we can change the field type to a text instead of a quoted narration to us, and the way to handle the situation can be quoted as a medium through which we can narrate the circumference, where I want the characters to be quoted as a prefix. Now the validation rule is quoted to us where we can't change the custom type or the data type. And copy this content and paste it in this vertical so that we can forward the statements the way we want. Quote this vertical as a proof and not as a or if you're not able to see the statements, then we can create a field which can help us to conclude the statements. Now, if we are quoting this field, that is the last domain change, as a field where we can change the name of the domain as a text field. It's 255 characters as a placement, and both last domain change, email change, instead of domain change we can put it as domain, last domain, email domain update as a reference, and then put this as a preliminary evidence. Now we want to open the triggers and the classes that we have quoted as a reference. Then we can quote this trigger as a preference in our case. Now I've quoted all the references to you. That is, if we make a mistake, if we want it to be quoted as a reference to us, where we have to update the changes, and then we have to put it as a narration, and then we have to help the statements to be quoted as a prefix. Then we have to quote the narration to our vertical. That is, now I can conclude this session by quoting this as a reference to the vertical which I'll be quoting as a narration to you. That is, the triggers which we have to focus on. Now, if I'm able to save this record and if the changes are not getting reflected, it is clear that we have performed the updates. Second, we understand that the main update is in place because of the reference. So when we are quoting any update, we should be clear with the vertical that we quote ourselves into. And if we are able to conclude our statements by just updating the narrations, where I wanted you to conduct yourself with reference to the vertical which we quoted our references to, especially the last email domains update as a result which we hold ourselves as no recursion occurs or bulk safe and kernel limit friendly. Then try this in your org and let me know if the field update is working as expected. Drop your answers in the comments. So here's the takeaway from this example. Keep triggers thin and delicate logic to helper classes. Use static variables to prevent recursion. Keep logic bulk safe, no DML or circle in loops. Even a small example like this demonstrates enterprise level thinking and prepares you for real projects and interviews. Mastering helper classes plus triggers and recursion prevention plus bulk safe design clears interviews, builds production ready confidence, shows you to think like a Salesforce consultant, not just a coder. This is how enterprise Salesforce solutions are designed. If this session helped you, like this video, share with someone learning Salesforce, comment your experience or question below. I read and reply to all the comments. Subscribe to Codeforce Chronicles. Your engagement helps me to create more practical hands-on tutorials for learners. Now, I want you to conclude your statements as a prefix to my vertical that I've quoted all the mistakes which you will be part of as a session and a quoted narration to my conference, and I want you to place your reference to me as a vertical. And in case you're able to quote yourself as a student of mine, you can focus on the deliverables, that is to contact to send a message on LinkedIn, Twitter or Instagram, or you can send an email to shrutinarsi@gmail.com, where my courses are available, that is the live sessions for rupees 5,000 and self-paced for 3,000 as a vertical, where admin, developer and advanced developer courses are available. When it comes to self-paced courses, you have to be able to conduct your review as a preference to the live sessions, where you wouldn't be able to be part of the live sessions as a record, as the recording wouldn't be placed as a statement to you. Now, if you want to speak to me, you can contact, you can note down my number, that is 80500330007. Thank you. Have a great day.